On May 15, 1951, General Omar Bradley took his seat in a witness chair in the Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. In front of him sat rows of senators, staff, reporters, and observers. Behind him, in the wider country, millions of Americans waited to see whether he would help defend or destroy the reputation of the most celebrated soldier of their time. The man at the center of the storm was General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, 71 years old, a Medal of Honor recipient, and a hero of 2 world wars. MacArthur wanted to transform the Korean War from a limited regional conflict into a far larger struggle that would reach deep into mainland China. He advocated bombing Chinese cities, blockading Chinese ports, and, if necessary, using atomic weapons. We'd like to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell the story of any family member who serves in the war. President Harry S. Truman had dismissed MacArthur 34 days earlier for insubordination. The decision had ignited a political firestorm. Much of the American public regarded MacArthur as a savior, and Truman as a weak president who refused to let the military win. Congress was flooded with telegrams and letters. Demonstrations praised MacArthur and condemned the White House. Opinion polls suggested that millions believed MacArthur had the correct strategy and Truman had made a catastrophic mistake. MacArthur had already had his moment before Congress. From May 3rd to May 5th, he testified for 3 days, presenting his strategic vision in meticulous detail. He spoke confidently and fluently. His arguments were tightly constructed, his rhetoric powerful, and his personal prestige immense. He claimed that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been in agreement with his views. He insisted that victory in Korea and the wider power struggle in Asia required aggressive action against China. Anything less, he said, amounted to appeasement. He received standing ovations. Now it was Omar Bradley's turn. Bradley was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior military officer in the United States. He had served in uniform for 43 years. In the Second World War, he had commanded more American soldiers in combat than any other general except Dwight Eisenhower. His reputation was the opposite of MacArthur's theatrical, larger-than-life persona. Bradley was soft-spoken, disciplined, and methodical. Enlisted men called him the GI's general because he was known to care deeply about the welfare of ordinary troops. Officers respected him for his lack of grandstanding and his reluctance to seek personal glory.
But Bradley now faced a challenge unlike any in his long career. He was convinced that MacArthur's strategy would not produce victory. He believed it would trigger a far greater disaster. In Bradley's judgment, expanding the Korean War into China risked starting World War III. He knew that the Soviet Union possessed atomic weapons. He knew that American forces were already stretched thin across multiple theaters. He knew that the central front of the Cold War was in Europe, not Asia, that the fate of Western Europe would determine the long-term balance of power with the Soviet bloc. Opening a major new front in Asia on China's doorstep would divert attention and resources away from Europe, strain alliances, and potentially provoke direct Soviet intervention. MacArthur's plan, in Bradley's view, threatened to weaken NATO, alienate key allies, and increase the risk of a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. Those conclusions led to an almost unprecedented situation in American military history. Bradley, a 4-star general, would have to stand before Congress and the American public and openly contradict a 5-star general and national icon. He would have to argue that the man millions regarded as a hero of Bataan, the liberator of the Philippines, and the conqueror of Japan, was not just mistaken, but dangerously wrong. Bradley had not entered that hearing room unprepared. He had spent the prior month studying every relevant piece of classified intelligence on Chinese and Soviet capabilities. He had conferred repeatedly with the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff: Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg, Army Chief of Staff General J. Lawton Collins, and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Forrest Sherman. All 3 agreed with his assessment. So did Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall, himself a five-star general and the former Army Chief of Staff who had overseen American strategy in World War II. The consensus among the top civilian and military leadership was clear. MacArthur's strategy was unacceptable. It risked catastrophic escalation. But explaining why in a public forum would be extraordinarily difficult. To lay out the full case would require referencing information that was still classified, details about American strengths and weaknesses, as well as the likely responses of the Soviet Union and China. Revealing too much could compromise national security. Revealing too little would allow MacArthur supporters to accuse the administration and the Joint Chiefs of cowardice or defeatism.
The hearings were technically closed, but heavily sanitized transcripts were released to the press every day. By evening, Bradley's words would be read in newspapers across the United States, reprinted, discussed, and argued over in homes, factories, and offices. He would have to speak with precision, stick strictly to verifiable facts, and yet still deliver a clear, forceful judgment. Behind the abstract arguments about strategy lay the human cost of MacArthur's decisions. That cost became brutally visible during the Chinese intervention that had begun in late October 1950. By the autumn of 1950, MacArthur had pushed United Nations forces far north, all the way to the Yalu River, which marked the border between Korea and China. This advance came despite repeated warnings that the People's Republic of China would enter the war if American troops approached too close to Chinese territory. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai had sent explicit warnings through diplomatic channels, including via India. The message was straightforward. If UN forces crossed the 38th parallel and moved deep into North Korea, China would intervene. MacArthur dismissed these warnings as bluff. He assured President Truman that the Chinese would not dare engage in large-scale combat with American forces. In his estimates, there might be around 100,000 Chinese troops in Manchuria, but he argued they were unlikely to cross into Korea, and if they did, American air power would annihilate them before they could pose a serious threat. He was wrong. On October 19, 1950, approximately 260,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River under strict secrecy. They moved at night, concealed themselves in the rugged terrain during the day, and used mountain routes that made effective American aerial reconnaissance extremely difficult. By late October, large Chinese forces were in position in the mountains of North Korea, waiting for the moment to strike. On November 1st, Chinese units attacked the U.S. 8th Cavalry Regiment near Unsan. Thousands of Chinese soldiers emerged seemingly out of nowhere, surrounding American positions in a coordinated three-pronged assault. The 8th Cavalry suffered more than 800 casualties in the first 48 hours, nearly a third of its strength. The surprise was total. American commanders had not realized substantial Chinese forces were already in country. Bradley and the other members of the Joint Chiefs had warned against pushing so far north. In October, they had sent instructions to MacArthur to rely mainly on South Korean forces near the Chinese border and keep American units farther south to reduce the risk of a direct confrontation with China. MacArthur ignored this guidance. He deployed American formations all the way to the Yalu, stretching them thin across a broad front, with overextended supply lines and limited mutual support.
When the Chinese offensive erupted, American units were dispersed, exposed, and vulnerable. The disaster intensified at the Chosin Reservoir. On November 27, 1950, roughly 120,000 Chinese troops from the 9th Army Group attacked X Corps in northeastern North Korea. MacArthur had ordered X Corps to drive northeast toward the Yalu, while the U.S. 8th Army advanced northwest, effectively splitting UN forces into two distinct commands separated by a mountain range.
The two forces could not easily support each other and found coordination extremely difficult. Conditions were brutal. Temperatures plunged to around -40 degrees Celsius. American Marines and soldiers fought for 17 days in sub-zero cold, conducting a fighting withdrawal to the port of Hungnam. More than 4,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or went missing in the battle. Platoon leaders had to make split-second decisions in treacherous mountain passes. Company commanders directed fire and movement, while men struggled to operate weapons with frostbitten hands. Battalion and regimental staffs organized withdrawals under constant pressure from Chinese attacks. After UN forces were driven out of North Korea, Chinese and North Korean units regrouped and struck again. On New Year's Eve 1950, they launched their third major offensive, this time against South Korean divisions. The assault forced yet another withdrawal. On January 4, 1951, UN forces abandoned Seoul to Communist forces for the second time in the war. American units served as rear guards, covering the retreat. Mortar fire, artillery, and small arms engagements claimed more lives during the withdrawal. By late January 1951, the consequences of MacArthur's strategic miscalculation were stark. From June to October 1950, before the Chinese intervention, American battle deaths had already reached more than 8,500. The Chinese offensives, from November through January, added thousands more. A significant portion of these casualties occurred after MacArthur pushed UN forces north, contrary to the warnings and recommendations of the Joint Chiefs. Many of those killed died in withdrawals from exposed positions that, in Bradley's view, should never have been occupied. Many died fighting an enemy that MacArthur had confidently predicted would not intervene. The casualty reports arrived at Bradley's office day after day. Each entry listed a name, rank, unit, and the circumstances of death or disappearance. Every report meant a telegram delivered to a family. Every report reflected a chain of command decision that had succeeded or failed. For Bradley, they were a continuous reminder of the price of strategic error.
Meanwhile, MacArthur continued to make public statements calling for escalating the conflict, more pressure on China, more aggressive military action, more willingness to expand the war beyond the Korean Peninsula. Bradley read the reports. He read MacArthur's statements. He understood the connection between the two. And he knew that MacArthur's new proposals, bombing Chinese territory, blockading its coast, possibly using atomic weapons, would magnify the cost, potentially on a scale far beyond what the country had yet seen. Doctrinally, MacArthur appeared to stand on familiar ground. The traditional American way of war in the 20th century had been one of total commitment and unconditional victory. That was how the United States had fought in World War I. That was how it had fought in World War II. Once engaged, America mobilized fully, aimed at decisive victory, and refused to accept anything less. MacArthur embodied that tradition. He had graduated first in his class at West Point. He had received the Medal of Honor. He had commanded the Southwest Pacific area in World War II, overseen the defeat of Japan, and directed the occupation that followed. His strategic audacity and personal charisma seemed to validate his belief in overwhelming offensive action. When he argued for extending the war into China, many Americans found his logic intuitive, even compelling. He maintained that China was more vulnerable than it appeared. He asserted that Chinese military power was overstated. He argued that bombing military bases in Manchuria would sever supply lines to communist forces in Korea. A naval blockade, he said, would choke the Chinese economy. Deploying Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces from Taiwan, he suggested, would open a second front and further stretch Chinese defensives. According to MacArthur, these measures would compel China to withdraw from Korea without the need for large additional American ground forces. On paper, the plan looked like a straightforward path to victory. But Bradley believed it was strategically reckless. The issue, as he saw it, was not the individual tactics, airstrikes, naval blockades, or the use of Allied forces. The core problem was MacArthur's failure to grasp the broader global balance of power. In a world now divided by the Cold War, with nuclear weapons in the hands of both superpowers, wars could no longer be treated as isolated contests to be won at any cost. A regional conflict in Asia could not be separated from its potential impact on Europe, on alliances, and on the risk of direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union.
That was the argument Bradley had brought with him into the Senate hearing room on May 15, 1951, that in the new atomic age, the United States could not afford to let one famous general's concept of total victory in a limited theater endanger the stability of the entire world. General Douglas MacArthur had spent the previous 5 years in Japan as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. During that period, his strategic worldview shifted. Surrounded by the responsibilities of occupation and reconstruction, he grew increasingly focused on Asia to the exclusion of the wider global balance of power. Within the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Omar Bradley privately referred to this outlook as Asia-first thinking, the belief that the fate of American influence depended primarily on dominance in the Pacific, that Asia had become more important than Europe, and that the Soviet Union would not intervene even if the United States moved militarily against China. Bradley regarded these assumptions as fundamentally incorrect. The intelligence estimates available to him painted a starkly different picture. The Soviet Union maintained roughly 175 divisions across its global military structure, with mobilization capacity to raise more than 300. By contrast, the United States had only 12 active divisions. Western European nations, still recovering economically and militarily after the devastation of World War II, were only beginning to rearm. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization had been established just 2 years earlier. European governments feared that any large diversion of American manpower or resources to Asia would leave Europe dangerously exposed to a potential Soviet offensive. Further complicating the situation was the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. If American forces struck Chinese territory, Joseph Stalin could choose to invoke the treaty and launch an attack against Western Europe. The United States did not possess the capacity to defend both theaters at once. Even if the Soviet Union refrained from direct military action, widening the war in Asia would almost certainly fracture the alliance network the United States had spent half a decade constructing. Britain, France, and other NATO partners had agreed to participate in the Korean conflict strictly because the war remained confined to the Korean peninsula. An American decision to bomb China would likely end that support. In the worst case, core allies might withdraw from NATO entirely, triggering the collapse of the Western security system. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs had attempted to convey these realities to MacArthur. In January 1951, they sent detailed strategic guidance to his headquarters, outlining the critical importance of limiting the conflict and describing the broader global implications. MacArthur acknowledged receipt of the messages, but continued publicly advocating for expanding operations into China.
In March 1951, President Truman prepared to initiate a peace proposal offering negotiations with Beijing. MacArthur was notified in advance and ordered not to make any public declarations concerning the diplomatic effort. On March 24th, however, MacArthur held a press conference in which he issued his own ultimatum to China, threatening to widen the war to coastal and interior Chinese targets. The statement immediately undermined the administration's diplomatic initiative. It alienated Allied governments, weakened Truman's political standing at home, and demonstrated that MacArthur would not adhere to presidential directives. American military doctrine required strict obedience to civilian authority, yet MacArthur had chosen to contradict official policy, bypassing the chain of command and presenting his own strategy directly to the public and to Congress. For Bradley and the Joint Chiefs, this was not ambiguous. It was insubordination, clear, documented, and undeniable. The confrontation reached a breaking point in early April. On April 6, 1951, Bradley met with President Truman, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and Secretary of State Dean Acheson in the White House. Truman asked whether the Joint Chiefs supported MacArthur's strategic proposals. Bradley answered that they did not. Truman then asked whether MacArthur should be relieved. Bradley replied that the decision was ultimately political, but from a military standpoint, MacArthur could no longer be trusted to carry out orders. The other service chiefs held the same view. 3 days later, on April 9, 1951, all 4 chiefs, Bradley, Collins, Sherman, and Vandenberg, formally recommended MacArthur's relief to Secretary Marshall. Their memorandum cited repeated acts of insubordination and a refusal to execute policies with which he disagreed. President Truman made his final decision on April 10th. At 1 a.m. on April 11, 1951, the White House issued the announcement. General Douglas MacArthur had been relieved of all commands. The reaction was immediate and explosive. MacArthur was a national icon. Truman's approval rating stood at 26%, and many Americans viewed him as an accidental president lacking authority. MacArthur, by contrast, was seen as a brilliant commander whose judgment had repeatedly delivered victory. To much of the public, the dismissal appeared to be political capitulation disguised as military necessity.
Every service chief reached the same conclusion. The United States lacked the capacity to wage a larger war in Asia without abandoning its obligations in Europe. Such a shift would create an opportunity the Soviet Union could exploit immediately. Bradley also analyzed political intelligence regarding America's allies. The British government had already stated that it would not support military action against China. France was engaged in a colonial conflict in Indochina and relied heavily on American assistance. Other NATO governments feared that any expansion of the war would draw them into a global conflict for which they were unprepared. If the United States attacked China, the alliance could splinter. In an extreme scenario, some nations might seek separate arrangements with Moscow, dissolving the post-war Western security structure entirely. MacArthur's proposals ignored these realities. His strategic thinking focused narrowly on Korea and China, and he dismissed broader geopolitical considerations as political interference. In his view, the war could be won by widening it. In Bradley's view, that mindset represented not military logic, but an outdated concept of total war incompatible with the atomic age. On the morning of May 15, 1951, Bradley entered the Senate hearing room. The chamber was crowded with senators, aides, journalists, and observers. MacArthur had testified there from May 3rd to May 5th, receiving repeated applause. Now Bradley would present the opposite case. He wore a plain uniform marked only by rank insignia. He looked fatigued. Weeks of preparation had left him with little rest. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, the committee chairman, called the hearing to order and invited Bradley to deliver the Joint Chiefs' assessment of MacArthur's proposals. Bradley opened his prepared statement. His voice remained steady. He began by acknowledging MacArthur's long service and extraordinary achievements. No one questioned his valor or devotion to duty. But then Bradley presented a judgment that no senior officer had stated publicly about MacArthur in decades. MacArthur's strategy was unsound. He explained the global situation with deliberate precision. He detailed Soviet military strength in both Europe and Asia. He outlined America's limited resources. He emphasized the indispensability of Allied support and described the consequences of losing it. Europe, not Asia, was the decisive theater. The outcome of the Cold War hinged on whether Western Europe remained secure. Turning to MacArthur's specific proposals, Bradley addressed them one at a time.
Bombing Chinese bases in Manchuria,
he explained, would require diverting American aircraft currently assigned to European defense. Such actions would almost certainly provoke Chinese retaliation. Until that point, the Chinese Air Force had refrained from attacking UN positions, ports, or U.S. bases in Japan. An American air campaign against China would end that restraint. Chinese bombers could target major Japanese cities, Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, where American air defenses were minimal. Bradley explained that expanding operations into China would expose millions of civilians to danger. Chinese retaliation could target population centers in Japan, where air defenses were minimal. MacArthur's proposal risked transforming the Korean conflict into a much broader war, one that could overwhelm American forces in the Pacific and potentially engulf the entire region. The naval blockade MacArthur advocated was no solution. To enforce it, the United States would need to divert ships from the Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets, already committed to defending sea lanes vital to NATO and containing Soviet naval forces. Such a blockade would take months to assemble. Even then, it would accomplish little. China's wartime supply chain did not rely primarily on maritime trade with the West. The Soviet Union transported most of China's military equipment by rail through Manchuria. No naval blockade could interdict that flow. With its reliance on land-based supply routes, China could sustain its war effort regardless of American naval operations. Strategically, the proposal offered no meaningful advantage. MacArthur also urged the United States to deploy nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. Bradley testified that such a move would be both militarily ineffective and politically destabilizing. The Joint Chiefs had studied Chiang Kai-shek's forces extensively. Their assessment was damning. Despite receiving more than $2 billion in American military aid between 1946 and 1949, Chiang's armies had collapsed in the Chinese Civil War. Their leadership had been weak, equipment inadequate, and training inconsistent. Their defeat had not resulted from a shortage of American support, but from corruption, poor command structures, and widespread morale problems. Bradley told senators in closed session that Chiang no longer possessed the military or political legitimacy necessary to rally the Chinese people against the communist regime. Even if nationalist forces could be landed on the mainland, they could not sustain operations. Most Chinese civilians did not accept Chiang's authority. Employing his troops would provide little tactical benefit while giving the Soviet Union a political pretext to intervene directly.
Moreover, widening the war offered no guarantee of achieving decisive victory. China had millions of troops available for deployment. In Korea, Chinese forces had demonstrated the ability to fight effectively against superior American firepower. They had pushed UN troops from the Yalu River to positions south of Seoul, doing so without employing their air force, without bombing UN supply lines, without attacking UN bases in Japan, and without attempting to disrupt shipping at the ports of Busan or Incheon. If the war expanded, these restraints would disappear. Chinese bombers could strike Japanese cities. Their air force could contest UN air operations. Supply lines extending hundreds of miles could be attacked. A broader conflict could force the United States to consider the use of atomic weapons, an act that would alienate every major ally and galvanize global opposition to the United States. Then, Bradley delivered the statement that would define the entire controversy. "I am under no illusion," he said, "that our present strategy of using means short of total war to achieve our ends and oppose communism is a guarantee that a world war will not be thrust upon us. But a policy of patience and determination, without provoking a world war while we improve our military power, is one which we believe we must continue to follow. Under present circumstances, we have recommended against enlarging the war from Korea to include Red China. Red China is not the powerful nation seeking to dominate the world. Frankly, in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this strategy would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemy." The impact was immediate. wrong war, wrong place, wrong time, wrong enemy. The words hung in the chamber. Reporters wrote furiously. Senators leaned in. The gallery fell silent. Bradley pressed the point. The primary adversary of the United States was the Soviet Union, not China. The critical front lay in Europe, not Asia. America's central objective was containing Soviet expansion, not overthrowing the Chinese government. MacArthur's plan ignored these strategic realities. It would weaken the United States where its strength was most vital, in pursuit of battlefield gains where they mattered least. Strategically, Bradley argued, the proposal was untenable. Bradley's testimony continued for hours. He responded to senators with exact figures, specific intelligence, and clear analysis. Much of what he said could only be delivered in closed session. Details concerning Soviet deployments, American vulnerabilities, and the precarious position of Western allies were too sensitive for public release. But the substance that did enter the public record had a cumulative effect. MacArthur's strategy was based on flawed assumptions and an outdated conception of war.
Over the following days, the other service chiefs testified, each presenting additional evidence contradicting MacArthur's claims. Air Force Chief Hoyt Vandenberg revealed highly classified information that stunned several senators. Approximately 85% of America's tactical air power was already committed to Korea. The Strategic Bomber Force, the core of America's nuclear deterrent, was being used in a tactical capacity to support operations on the peninsula. Very little air strength remained to defend Europe. Implementing MacArthur's plan would require transferring aircraft from Europe to Asia, leaving NATO vulnerable to Soviet attack. Because of its sensitivity, this portion of Vandenberg's testimony was removed from the published transcripts. It was not made public until the 1970s. Only then did Americans understand how dangerously overstretched their military had been, and how close MacArthur's plan had come to provoking a war the United States was not prepared to fight. Army Chief of Staff J. Lawton Collins countered MacArthur's claims about Chinese weakness. He testified that the Chinese had committed only a portion of their available forces and had yet to use key elements of their military power. They had not deployed their air force. They had not attacked U.S. installations in Japan. They had not attempted to bomb UN supply routes, which remained long, exposed, and vulnerable. They had not attempted to project power into Japan, where air defenses were negligible. If the war expanded, Collins warned, Chinese escalation would be immediate and extensive. The conflict could evolve into a massive war of attrition in Asia, a front the United States could not afford while simultaneously protecting Europe. The decisive testimony came from Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall. Marshall had been Army Chief of Staff during World War II, the architect of Allied strategy, and the creator of the Marshall Plan. His reputation was unmatched. When Marshall spoke, Congress and the country listened.
Marshall testified that MacArthur's insubordination had irreparably compromised his command authority. The issue no longer centered merely on strategy. It had become a test of whether civilian control of the military would endure. MacArthur had publicly contradicted administration policy, undermined peace efforts, and attempted to mobilize public pressure against the president. In a constitutional republic, Marshall said, military officers did not conduct independent foreign policy. They either obeyed the president or resigned their commissions. If the president could not control his commanders, the entire chain of command would disintegrate. The military would become accountable not to elected civilian leadership, but to its most popular generals, a path historically associated not with democracies, but with military rule. Marshall's words carried unique authority. He was respected across political lines, trusted by leaders of both parties, and admired by the public.
When he concluded that MacArthur was wrong and that relieving him had been necessary, the impact was profound. With Bradley's analysis, the testimony of the Joint Chiefs, and Marshall's unequivocal condemnation, the Senate hearings dismantled MacArthur's case piece by piece. MacArthur claimed the Joint Chiefs supported him. They testified under oath that they did not. MacArthur insisted his plan would yield quick victory. They testified it could trigger a global war. MacArthur said China was weak. They testified China had not yet employed the majority of its military power. MacArthur asserted the Soviet Union would not intervene. They testified intervention was likely and potentially catastrophic. The hearings lasted 7 weeks. More than 2 million words of testimony were recorded. The American public did not change its mind overnight. But as the hearings progressed and the testimony of Bradley, the Joint Chiefs, and Marshall filtered out through newspapers, radio, and the emerging medium of television, opinion gradually shifted. MacArthur's vision still sounded compelling in speeches. It promised clarity, decisive action, and an end to stalemate. On the surface, the logic appeared straightforward. Strike China, cut its supply lines, bring the war to a close on American terms. For many citizens, especially those who had lived through World War II, the idea that victory should be total and unconditional remained deeply ingrained. What Bradley and the other senior commanders offered was something very different, a detailed, methodical dismantling of that vision. They spoke not in slogans, but in numbers, logistics, intelligence estimates, and alliance calculations. They had access to classified information. They understood the full global picture. And their conclusion was unambiguous. MacArthur's strategy would not bring quick victory. It risked catastrophic defeat.
Bradley's summary: the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy became the defining phrase of the entire controversy. Newspapers reprinted it repeatedly. Editorial writers dissected it. Radio commentators debated its implications. It distilled a complex strategic argument into a single memorable judgment. The phrase embodied Bradley's core point. In Korea, the United States was fighting a limited war to contain communist expansion, not to destroy it everywhere at once. That approach, he argued, was the correct one in the nuclear era. Expanding the conflict into China would mean waging the wrong war, a discretionary war of choice instead of a necessary war of containment. Doing so on the Asian mainland would mean fighting in the wrong place, a vast continental theater that neutralized American advantages in mobility, technology, and industrial power. Escalating at a moment when U.S. forces were under strength and Western allies were opposed would make it the wrong time, a period when the United States needed years to build military and economic strength. And China, in Bradley's view, was the wrong enemy. The immediate and central threat to the balance of power remained the Soviet Union in Europe. MacArthur, Bradley argued, wanted to commit American forces to a war the United States could not win, on terrain strategically secondary against a power that was not the primary danger. By mid-June 1951, public opinion polls reflected a measurable shift. Support for Truman's decision to relieve MacArthur rose steadily. Support for MacArthur's proposed strategy declined. At the same time, Americans slowly began to grasp the logic behind a concept that had scarcely existed in public consciousness before Korea: limited war. Total war in the nuclear age no longer meant what it had in 1918 or 1945. With atomic weapons in both American and Soviet arsenals, a general war could mean not merely massive casualties, but the possible destruction of modern civilization. Limited war, fighting for constrained objectives, accepting armistice instead of unconditional surrender, became a necessary adaptation. It was unsatisfying compared to the clear-cut victories of World War II. Casualties were still incurred, but the outcome might be a stalemate instead of a triumph. Families grieved without the emotional consolation of a decisive victory. Strategically, however, it made sense. Bradley's calm, precise explanation helped lawmakers and the broader public accept that logic. Even some of MacArthur's most ardent supporters in Congress began to reconsider their positions.
The hearings concluded on June 27, 1951. The Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees issued a joint report. It affirmed that President Truman had acted within his constitutional authority in relieving MacArthur and that the decision was appropriate under the circumstances. The report stated that MacArthur's strategy lacked the support of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and documented his repeated violations of orders prohibiting unauthorized public statements on policy. It recommended that future large-scale military operations require clearer congressional authorization to reduce the likelihood of similar confrontations between civilian and military authorities. The report was carefully phrased. It avoided direct personal condemnation of MacArthur, reflecting the high regard in which many still held him. Yet, in substance, it supported Truman's actions and reinforced the principle of civilian control. Bradley received no special public honor for his role. There were no decorations specific to his testimony, no public commemorations, no celebration of his contribution. He had done what he believed duty required: contradict a senior and far more celebrated officer to avert a strategic disaster, and then return quietly to his responsibilities. In the official narrative, Truman's courage and Marshall's strategic judgment received most of the credit. Bradley's contributions were often relegated to the footnotes. Within the professional military, however, the significance of his actions was understood. Bradley had helped preserve civilian supremacy over the armed forces. He had played a key role in preventing a potential Third World War. And he had established, in practice, the principle that sound strategic judgment mattered more than popularity, prestige, or reputation for battlefield brilliance. MacArthur's influence declined rapidly after the hearings. He never again held military command. He delivered speeches, appeared at Republican gatherings, and wrote his memoirs. For a brief period, particularly in 1951 to 1952, some political figures floated his name as a potential presidential candidate. But as the full content of the Senate testimony became better known, his political support eroded. The public began to recognize that the strategy he had championed had been far more dangerous than it first appeared. By early 1952, MacArthur had settled into retirement at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. He would live there for the next 12 years, remaining a symbolic figure but increasingly removed from active public life.
In the 1952 presidential election, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Bradley's former colleague and wartime superior in Europe, won the presidency. Part of his appeal was his promise to go to Korea and seek an end to the war. Eisenhower and Bradley had shared similar views on grand strategy during World War II, the importance of alliance cohesion, the centrality of Europe, and the need to balance military objectives with political realities. Eisenhower understood limited war and global strategy in a way MacArthur never had. When he took office in January 1953, he did not expand the conflict into China. He did not authorize bombing campaigns against Manchurian bases. He did not deploy nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. He did not order a naval blockade of the Chinese coast. Instead, he quietly combined negotiation with pressure. Among other signals, Eisenhower allowed it to be understood that if talks failed, the United States might consider the use of nuclear weapons. Historians continued to debate how decisive that signal was, but it may have contributed to Chinese willingness to reach an agreement. On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. The fighting ceased. A demilitarized zone was established roughly along the 38th parallel.
the same line that had originally divided North and South Korea. In territorial terms, very little had changed. North Korea remained under the rule of Kim Il-sung. South Korea remained under Syngman Rhee. There was no unconditional surrender, no enemy government toppled, no occupation regime imposed. But World War III had not begun. NATO had held together under the strain and even expanded, formally bringing Greece and Turkey into the alliance. The Soviet Union had not launched an attack on Western Europe. The transatlantic alliance system, painstakingly built after 1945, remained intact. The American commitment to European defense had been tested and reinforced rather than undermined. The human cost of the Korean War was immense. Nearly 37,000 American service members were killed in action. Over 100,000 were wounded. Thousands remained missing in action, their fates unresolved for families and comrades. Korean, Chinese, and Allied casualties were far higher still. Yet for all its devastation, the conflict had not escalated into a general nuclear war. Atomic weapons had been used only once in history, in 1945, and they were not used again in Korea. That outcome, painful, imperfect, but short of global catastrophe, was the kind of victory Bradley had fought for. Not triumphal banners or sweeping conquests, but the avoidance of a far worse disaster. Bradley remained chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff until August 16, 1953, completing the term to which Truman had appointed him in 1949. He retired from active duty after 41 years of service, having entered West Point in 1911, fought in 2 world wars, and guided American strategy during the early Cold War. In retirement, Bradley led a relatively quiet life. He wrote his memoir, A Soldier's Story, recounting his World War II experiences and perspectives on command. He later served as chairman of the board of the Bulova Watch Company from 1958 to 1973, sat on several corporate boards, and occasionally spoke at military reunions and professional gatherings. He rarely discussed the MacArthur episode in public, preferring to let the official records and congressional transcripts speak for themselves. He sought no public controversy and avoided personal attacks. Bradley's wife, Mary, died of leukemia in 1965. He continued to live a private, largely low-profile life. In 1981, near the end of his life, Bradley gave one of his last extensive interviews to a military historian researching the MacArthur hearings. Bradley was 88 years old, but still mentally sharp. When asked about his decision to testify against MacArthur 3 decades earlier, he paused for some time before answering. He said that opposing MacArthur in public had been the most difficult decision of his military career, harder, in his view, than any combat decision he had made in World War II. The norms instilled at West Point and reinforced by decades of service emphasized loyalty up the chain of command. Officers were expected to support their superiors, not challenge them publicly. Bradley explained that he had eventually concluded that loyalty to the Constitution and to the nation had to take precedence over personal loyalty to any one commander, no matter how revered. MacArthur's strategy, in Bradley's judgment, would have shattered the Western alliance system painstakingly assembled after World War II. It would have isolated the United States from its allies. It might well have triggered nuclear war with the Soviet Union. In the face of stakes that high, remaining silent out of deference was not an option. Someone had to state plainly that the proposed strategy was dangerous and unsound. Bradley admitted that the aftermath had taken a personal toll. For years, he received hostile letters from MacArthur supporters, some branding him a coward, others accusing him of subversion or disloyalty. The criticism was often deeply personal, but he maintained that he had no regrets. The principle of civilian control, he believed,
was fundamental to American democracy and had to be upheld regardless of personal cost. He restated a core premise: military officers provide professional advice to civilian leaders, but civilians decide questions of war and peace. Officers who cannot accept those decisions must resign their commissions. They cannot conduct their own foreign policy through press conferences, letters, or public speeches.
That principle had been pushed to the limit in 1951 and had survived only because a sufficient number of senior officers, Bradley, Marshall, Collins, Sherman, Vandenberg, were willing to defend it, even when doing so meant opposing a celebrated colleague. When asked whether he believed MacArthur ever came to understand why his strategy had been rejected, Bradley chose his words cautiously. He acknowledged that MacArthur was a gifted operational commander. The landing at Incheon had been a daring and effective maneuver. His Pacific campaigns in World War II had shown ingenuity and initiative. On the tactical and operational levels, MacArthur was undeniably capable, but Bradley described him as a poor strategist. MacArthur thought primarily in terms of local victory within his theater of operations. He did not fully grasp alliance dynamics or the way political constraints shaped military options. He did not, Bradley believed, understand the implications of nuclear weapons for grand strategy. He treated Korea as if it were another World War II-style campaign, with total victory as the only acceptable outcome. In Bradley's assessment, history did not. On April 8, 1981, Omar Nelson Bradley died at the age of 88. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His headstone listed his rank and service dates. It did not mention his Senate testimony. It did not reference the wrong war formulation. It did not claim credit for preventing a wider war. Most public obituaries concentrated on his World War II record, his role in Normandy, his leadership in the European campaign, and his contributions to the defeat of Nazi Germany. The MacArthur episode appeared, if at all, as a brief mention.
Among military historians and students of civil-military relations, however, Bradley's testimony in 1951 came to be seen as a turning point. Before Korea, American strategic culture had largely equated victory with total war and unconditional surrender. After Korea, and particularly after Bradley's explanations, Americans began to accept that limited objectives and negotiated outcomes might sometimes be the only rational choices in a nuclear-armed world. Before the hearings, it was still plausible for a popular general to challenge civilian policy openly and appeal directly to public opinion. Afterward, such behavior was widely regarded as insubordination. Before Bradley, many thought of strategy almost exclusively in military terms: movement, firepower, and battlefield success. After Bradley, serious strategy also had to account for alliances, nuclear thresholds, and global balances. Bradley did not write the formal doctrine of limited war. That work was done by theorists, policymakers, and planners. But he gave that doctrine practical authority by embodying it in a moment of public decision when it counted most. He demonstrated that professional military judgment rooted in global realities could prevail over the prestige of a single iconic commander. The Pentagon retains the transcripts of his 1951 testimony. They are studied at war colleges and referenced in courses on strategy and civil-military relations. The key sentence, "Wrong war, wrong place, wrong time, wrong enemy," has been quoted in textbooks, lectures, and policy debates. It has been applied to later conflicts. Critics of the Vietnam War invoked it. Opponents of the Iraq War did the same. The phrase has become a shorthand way of describing fundamental strategic misalignment. Yet the man behind the words is often overlooked. In many respects, Bradley was the inverse of MacArthur. MacArthur sought the spotlight. Bradley avoided it. MacArthur crafted dramatic public addresses. Bradley drafted careful memoranda.
MacArthur favored ornate uniforms and visible honors. Bradley wore simple dress with minimal insignia. MacArthur believed that military genius could override political constraints. Bradley believed that military professionals must operate within them. In 1951, those two philosophies collided. Bradley's prevailed not because he was more charismatic or more celebrated, but because his analysis was more attuned to the realities of the nuclear age. That is how strategic wisdom usually functions in democratic systems. It does not always arrive with dramatic speeches or sweeping gestures. It often appears instead as a quiet, detailed briefing, a carefully reasoned argument, an unpopular but necessary warning. It requires people in uniform to tell civilian leaders what they need to hear, not what they might prefer to hear, and to accept the personal consequences.
Bradley saw that MacArthur's plan would lead to disaster. He explained why. He accepted the cost of opposing a national hero. He helped prevent a war that could have escalated beyond control. There were no monuments raised to honor that decision. No aircraft carriers bear his name. No widely known feature film dramatizes his Senate appearance. But the consequences are written into the subsequent history of the Cold War. The Korean conflict remained limited. NATO endured. The Soviet Union did not conquer Western Europe, and civilian control of the military in the United States remained intact. Bradley's testimony was delivered in a single hearing room over the course of a few hours to an audience of senators, staff, and reporters. Most Americans never read the full transcript. Yet that testimony helped avert one of the gravest potential strategic errors in American history and solidified principles that still shape U.S. civil-military relations more than 70 years later. Military officers serve under civilian authority. Sound strategy considers global consequences, not just local victories. Public enthusiasm alone does not determine military policy. And sometimes the highest act of loyalty is the courage to say that a revered figure is wrong. Bradley did that. The United States and much of the post-war world order endured in part because he did. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from California to Cairo. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.